Holocaust denial is a form of genocide denial drawing on antisemitic conspiracy theories that asserts that the Nazi genocide of Jews, known as the Holocaust, is a myth, fabrication, or exaggeration. Holocaust deniers make one or more of the following false statements. Nazi Germany's final solution was aimed only at deporting Jews and did not include their extermination. Nazi authorities did not use extermination camps and gas chambers for the genocidal mass murder of Jews. The actual number of Jews murdered is significantly lower than the accepted figure of approximately 6 million, typically around a tenth of that figure. The Holocaust is a hoax perpetrated by the Allies, Jews, and/or Soviet Union. The methodologies of Holocaust deniers are based on a predetermined conclusion that ignores overwhelming historical evidence to the contrary. Scholars use the term denial to describe the views and methodology of Holocaust deniers in order to distinguish them from legitimate historical revisionists, who challenge orthodox interpretations of history using established historical methodologies. Holocaust deniers generally do not accept denial as an appropriate description of their activities and use the euphemism revisionism instead. In some former Eastern Bloc countries, Holocaust deniers do not deny the mass murder of Jews but deny the participation of their own nationals in the Holocaust. Holocaust denial is considered a serious societal problem in many places where it occurs, and it is illegal in Israel and many European countries. Terminology and scope. Terminology. The first recorded use of the term Holocaust in its modern sense was in 1895 by the New York Times to describe the massacre of Armenian Christians by Ottoman forces. The term comes from the Greek, lambda kappa alpha upsilon sigma tau omicron, Romanized, holocaustos, lambda omicron holos, whole plus kappa alpha upsilon sigma tau kaustos, burnt offering. The biblical term show, meaning calamity, became the standard Hebrew term for the murder of the European Jews. According to Haaretz, the writer Yehuda Erez may have been the first to describe events in Germany as the show. Davar and later Haaretz both used the term in September 1939. On October 3, 1941 the American Hebrew used the phrase before the Holocaust, apparently to refer to the situation in France, and in May 1943 the New York Times, discussing the Bermuda Conference, referred to the hundreds of thousands of European Jews still surviving the Nazi Holocaust. In 1968 the Library of Congress created a new category, Holocaust, Jewish. The term was popularized in the United States by the NBC miniseries Holocaust about a fictional family of German Jews, and in November that year the President's Commission on the Holocaust was established. As non-Jewish groups began to include themselves as Holocaust victims, many Jews chose to use the Hebrew terms show or churban. The Nazis used the phrase final solution to the Jewish question. Definition. Holocaust historians commonly define the Holocaust as the genocide of the European Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1941 and 1945. Donald Newick and Francis Nicosia, in the Columbia Guide to the Holocaust, favor a definition that includes the Jews, Roma, and disabled people, the systematic, state-sponsored murder of entire groups determined by heredity. Other groups targeted after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933 include those whom the Nazis viewed as inherently inferior, and those targeted because of their beliefs or behavior. Peter Hayes writes that the persecution of these groups was less uniform than that of the Jews. For example, the Nazis' treatment of the Slavs consisted of enslavement and gradual attrition. While some Slavs were favored, Hayes lists Bulgarians, Croats, Slovaks, and some Ukrainians. In contrast, according to historian Dan Stone, Hitler regarded the Jews as a Gegenrasse, a counter-race, not really human at all. Distinctive features. Genocidal state. The logistics of the mass murder turned Germany into what Michael Birnbaum called a genocidal state. Eberhard Jäckel wrote in 1986 that it was the first time a state had thrown its power behind the idea that an entire people should be wiped out. In total, 165,200 German Jews were murdered. Anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was to be exterminated, and complex rules were devised to deal with miscling. Bureaucrats identified who was a Jew, confiscated property, and scheduled trains to deport them. Companies fired Jews and later used them as slave labor. Universities dismissed Jewish faculty and students. German pharmaceutical companies tested drugs on camp prisoners, other companies built the crematoria. As prisoners entered the death camps, they surrendered all personal property, which was catalogued and tagged before being sent to Germany for reuse or recycling. Through a concealed account, the German National Bank helped launder valuables stolen from the victims. Medical experiments. At least 7,000 camp inmates were subjected to medical experiments, most died during them or as a result. The experiments, which took place at Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, Natzweiler-Struthof, Neuengamme, Ravensbrück, and Sachsenhausen, sought to uncover strategies to counteract chemical weapons, survive harsh environments, develop new vaccines and drugs and treat wounds. Many men and women were also involuntarily sterilized. After the war, 23 senior physicians and other medical personnel were charged at Nuremberg with crimes against humanity. They included the head of the German Red Cross, tenured professors, clinic directors, and biomedical researchers. The most notorious physician was Joseph Mengele, an SS officer who became the Auschwitz camp doctor on May 30, 1943. Interested in genetics, and keen to experiment on twins, he would pick out subjects on the ramp from the new arrivals during selection, shouting "Zwilling Heroes." The twins would be measured, killed, and dissected. One of Mengele's assistants said in 1946 that he was told to send organs of interest to the directors of the Anthropological Institute in Berlin-Dahlem. This is thought to refer to Mengele's academic supervisor, Ottmar Freiherr von Virchow, director from October 1942 of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics in Berlin-Dahlem. Origins: Antisemitism and the I-Volkisch/I movement. None. Germany after World War I, Hitler's worldview. After World War I, many Germans did not accept that their country had been defeated. A stab-in-the-back myth developed, insinuating that disloyal politicians, chiefly Jews and communists, had orchestrated Germany's surrender. Inflaming the anti-Jewish sentiment was the apparent over-representation of Jews in the leadership of communist revolutionary governments in Europe, such as Ernst Toller, head of a short-lived revolutionary government in Bavaria. This perception contributed to the canard of Jewish Bolshevism. Early anti-Semites in the Nazi Party included Dietrich Eckart, publisher of the Volkisker Beobachter, the party's newspaper, and Alfred Rosenberg, who wrote antisemitic articles for it in the 1920s. Rosenberg's vision of a secretive Jewish conspiracy ruling the world would influence Hitler's views of Jews by making them the driving force behind communism. Central to Hitler's worldview was the idea of expansion and Lebensraum in Eastern Europe for German Aryans, a policy of what Doris Bergen called race and space. Open about his hatred of Jews, he subscribed to common antisemitic stereotypes. From the early 1920s onwards, he compared the Jews to germs and said they should be dealt with in the same way. He viewed Marxism as a Jewish doctrine, said he was fighting against Jewish Marxism, and believed that Jews had created communism as part of a conspiracy to destroy Germany. Rise of Nazi Germany. Dictatorship and repression. With the appointment in January 1933 of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany and the Nazis' seizure of power, German leaders proclaimed the rebirth of the Volksgemeinschaft. Nazi policies divided the population into two groups, the Volksgenossen who belonged to the Volksgemeinschaft, and the Gemeenschapsvreemd who did not. Enemies were divided into three groups: the racial or blood enemies, such as the Jews and Roma; political opponents of Nazism, such as Marxists, liberals, Christians, and the reactionaries viewed as wayward national comrades; and moral opponents, such as gay men, the work-shy, and habitual criminals. The latter two groups were to be sent to concentration camps for re-education, with the aim of eventual absorption into the Volksgemeinschaft. Racial enemies could never belong to the Volksgemeinschaft; they were to be removed from society. Before and after the March 1933 Reichstag elections, the Nazis intensified their campaign of violence against opponents, setting up concentration camps for extrajudicial imprisonment. One of the first, at Dachau, opened on March 22, 1933. Initially the camp contained mostly communists and social democrats. Other early prisons were consolidated by mid-1934 into purpose-built camps outside the cities, run exclusively by the SS. The camps served as a deterrent by terrorizing Germans who did not support the regime. Throughout the 1930s, the legal, economic, and social rights of Jews were steadily restricted. On April 1, 1933, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses. On April 7, 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was passed, which excluded Jews and other non-Aryans from the civil service. Jews were disbarred from practicing law, being editors or proprietors of newspapers, joining the Journalists' Association, or owning farms. In Silesia, in March 1933, a group of men entered the courthouse and beat up Jewish lawyers. Friedlander writes that, in Dresden, Jewish lawyers and judges were dragged out of courtrooms during trials. Jewish students were restricted by quotas from attending schools and universities. Jewish businesses were targeted for closure or Aryanization, the forcible sale to Germans. Of the approximately 50,000 Jewish-owned businesses in Germany in 1933, about 7,000 were still Jewish-owned in April 1939. Works by Jewish composers, authors, and artists were excluded from publications, performances, and exhibitions. Jewish doctors were dismissed or urged to resign. The Deutsches Arteblatt reported on April 6, 1933, Germans are to be treated by Germans only. Sterilization law, I action T4/I. None. Nuremberg laws, Jewish emigration. On September 15, 1935, the Reichstag passed the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, known as the Nuremberg Laws. The former said that only those of German or kindred blood could be citizens. Anyone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents was classified as a Jew. The second law said, marriages between Jews and subjects of the state of German or related blood are forbidden. Sexual relationships between them were also criminalized. Jews were not allowed to employ German women under the age of 45 in their homes. The laws referred to Jews but applied equally to the Roma and Black Germans. Although other European countries, Bulgaria, independent state of Croatia, Hungary, Italy, Romania, Slovakia, and Vichy France passed similar legislation, Gerlach notes that Nazi Germany adopted more nationwide anti-Jewish laws and regulations than any other state. By the end of 1934, 50,000 German Jews had left Germany, and by the end of 1938, approximately half the German Jewish population had left, among them the conductor Bruno Walter, who fled after being told that the hall of the Berlin Philharmonic would be burned down if he conducted a concert there. Albert Einstein, who was in the United States when Hitler came to power, never returned to Germany. His citizenship was revoked and he was expelled from the Kaiser Wilhelm Society and Prussian Academy of Sciences. Other Jewish scientists, including Gustav Hertz, lost their teaching positions and left the country. I Anschluss/I. None. I Kristallnacht/I. None. Resettlement. Before World War II, Germany considered mass deportation from Europe of German, and later European, Jewry. Among the areas considered for possible resettlement were British Palestine and, after the war began, French Madagascar, Siberia, and 2 reservations in Poland. Palestine was the only location to which any German resettlement plan produced results, via the Havre Agreement between the Zionist Federation of Germany and the German government. Between November 1933 and December 1939, the agreement resulted in the emigration of about 53,000 German Jews, who were allowed to transfer Rm 100 million of their assets to Palestine by buying German goods, in violation of the Jewish-led anti-Nazi boycott of 1933. Outbreak of World War II. Invasion of Poland. Ghettos. Pogroms in occupied eastern Poland. German Nazi extermination camps in Poland. Invasion of Norway and Denmark. Germany invaded Norway and Denmark on April 9, 1940, during Operation Weserübung. Denmark was overrun so quickly that there was no time for a resistance to form. Consequently, the Danish government stayed in power and the Germans found it easier to work through it. Because of this, few measures were taken against the Danish Jews before 1942. By June 1940 Norway was completely occupied. In late 1940, the country's 1,800 Jews were banned from certain occupations, and in 1941 all Jews had to register their property with the government. On November 26, 1942, 532 Jews were taken by police officers, at 4 o'clock in the morning, to Oslo harbor, where they boarded a German ship. From Germany they were sent by freight train to Auschwitz. According to Dan Stone, only 9 survived the war. Invasion of France and the Low Countries. In May 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and France. After Belgium's surrender, the country was ruled by a German military governor, Alexander von Falkenhausen, who enacted anti-Jewish measures against its 90,000 Jews, many of them refugees from Germany or Eastern Europe. In the Netherlands, the Germans installed Arthur Seyss-Inquart as Reichskommissar, who began to persecute the country's 140,000 Jews. Jews were forced out of their jobs and had to register with the government. In February 1941, non-Jewish Dutch citizens staged a strike in protest that was quickly crushed. From July 1942, over 107,000 Dutch Jews were deported, only 5,000 survived the war. Most were sent to Auschwitz. The first transport of 1,135 Jews left Holland for Auschwitz on July 15, 1942. Between March 2 and July 20, 1943, 34,313 Jews were sent in 19 transports to the Sobibor extermination camp, where all but 18 are thought to have been gassed on arrival. France had approximately 330,000 Jews, divided between the German-occupied north and the unoccupied collaborationist southern areas in Vichy France. More than half this Jewish population were not French citizens, but refugees who had fled Nazi persecution in other countries. The occupied regions were under the control of a military governor, and there, anti-Jewish measures were not enacted as quickly as they were in the Vichy-controlled areas. In July 1940, the Jews in the parts of Alsace-Lorraine that had been annexed to Germany were expelled into Vichy France. Vichy France's government implemented anti-Jewish measures in metropolitan France, in French Algeria and in the 2 French protectorates of Tunisia and Morocco. Tunisia had 85,000 Jews when the Germans and Italians arrived in November 1942, an estimated 5,000 Jews were subjected to forced labor. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates that between 72,900 and 74,000 Jews were murdered during the Holocaust in France. Madagascar Plan. The fall of France gave rise to the Madagascar Plan in the summer of 1940, when French Madagascar in Southeast Africa became the focus of discussions about deporting all European Jews there. It was thought that the area's harsh living conditions would hasten deaths. Several Polish, French and British leaders had discussed the idea in the 1930s, as did German leaders from 1938. Adolf Eichmann's office was ordered to investigate the option, but no evidence of planning exists until after the defeat of France in June 1940. Germany's inability to defeat Britain, something that was obvious to the Germans by September 1940, prevented the movement of Jews across the seas, and the Foreign Ministry abandoned the plan in February 1942. Invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. Yugoslavia and Greece were invaded in April 1941 and surrendered before the end of the month. Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria divided Greece into occupation zones but did not eliminate it as a country. The pre-war Greek Jewish population had been between 72,000 and 77,000. By the end of the war, some 10,000 remained, representing the lowest survival rate in the Balkans and among the lowest in Europe. Yugoslavia, home to 80,000 Jews, was dismembered. Regions in the north were annexed by Germany and Hungary, regions along the coast were made part of Italy, Kosovo, and Western Macedonia were given to Albania, while Bulgaria received Eastern Macedonia. The rest of the country was divided into the independent state of Croatia, an Italian-German puppet state whose territory comprised Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, with the Croatian fascist Usti party placed in power, and German-occupied Serbia, governed by German military and police administrators who appointed the Serbian collaborationist puppet government, Government of National Salvation, headed by Milan Nedic. In August 1942 Serbia was declared free of Jews, after the Wehrmacht and German police, assisted by collaborators of the Nedic government and others such as Zeber, a pro-Nazi and pan-Serbian fascist party, had murdered nearly the entire population of 17,000 Jews. In the independent state of Croatia, the Nazi regime demanded that its rulers, the Usti, adopt antisemitic racial policies, persecute Jews, and set up several concentration camps. NDH leader Ante Pavlik and the Usti accepted Nazi demands. By the end of April 1941 the Usti required all Jews to wear insignia, typically a yellow Star of David, and started confiscating Jewish property in October 1941. During the same time as their persecution of Serbs and Roma, the Usti took part in the Holocaust, and killed the majority of the country's Jews. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates that 30,148 Jews were murdered. According to Jozo Tomasevic, the Jewish community in Zagreb was the only one to survive out of 115 Jewish religious communities in Yugoslavia in 1939–1940. The state broke away from Nazi anti-Semitic policy by promising honorary Aryan citizenship, and thus freedom from persecution, to Jews who were willing to contribute to the Croat cause. Marcus Tanner states that the SS complained that at least 5,000 Jews were still alive in the NDH and that thousands of others had emigrated, by buying honorary Aryan status. Nevenko Bart Ulin, however, posits that of the total Jewish population of the NDH, only 100 Jews attained the legal status of Aryan citizens, 500 including their families. In both cases a relatively small portion out of a Jewish population of 37,000. In the Bulgarian annexed zones of Macedonia and Thrace, upon demand of the German authorities, the Bulgarians handed over the entire Jewish population, about 12,000 Jews, to the military authorities. All were deported. Invasion of the Soviet Union. Reasons. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, a day Timothy Snyder called one of the most significant days in the history of Europe, the beginning of a calamity that defies description. German propaganda portrayed the conflict as an ideological war between German National Socialism and Jewish Bolshevism, and as a racial war between the Germans and the Jewish, Romani, and Slavic Untermenschen. The war was driven by the need for resources, including, according to David Cesarani, agricultural land to feed Germany, natural resources for German industry, and control over Europe's largest oil fields. Between early fall 1941 and late spring 1942, Jürgen Mathaus writes, 2 million of the 3.5 million Soviet POWs captured by the Wehrmacht had been executed or had died of neglect and abuse. By 1944 the Soviet death toll was at least 20 million. Mass shootings. As German troops advanced, the mass shooting of anti-German elements was assigned, as in Poland, to the Einsatzgruppen, this time under the command of Reinhard Heydrich. The point of the attacks was to destroy the local Communist Party leadership and therefore the state, including Jews in the party and state employment, and any radical elements. Cesarani writes that the killing of Jews was at this point a subset of these activities. Typically, victims would undress and give up their valuables before lining up beside a ditch to be shot, or they would be forced to climb into the ditch, lie on a lower layer of corpses, and wait to be killed. The latter was known as Sardinenpackung, a method reportedly started by SS officer Friedrich Jeckeln. According to Wolfram Wett, the German army took part in these shootings as bystanders, photographers, and active shooters. In Lithuania, Latvia, and western Ukraine, locals were deeply involved. Latvian and Lithuanian units participated in the murder of Jews in Belarus, and in the south, Ukrainians killed about 24,000 Jews. Some Ukrainians went to Poland to serve as guards in the camps. Einsatzgruppe A arrived in the Baltic states with Army Group North, Einsatzgruppe B in Belarus with Army Group Center, Einsatzgruppe C in the Ukraine with Army Group South, and Einsatzgruppe D went further south into Ukraine with the 11th Army. Each Einsatzgruppe numbered around 601,000 men, with a few women in administrative roles. Traveling with 9 German Order Police battalions and 3 units of the Waffen-SS, the Einsatzgruppen and their local collaborators had murdered almost 500,000 people by the winter of 1941–1942. By the end of the war, they had killed around 2 million, including about 1.3 million Jews and up to 250,000 Roma. Notable massacres include the July 1941 Ponary massacre near Vilnius, in which Einsatzgruppe B and Lithuanian collaborators shot at least 70,000 Jews, 20,000 Poles, and 8,000 Russians. In the Kamianets-Podilskaya massacre, nearly 24,000 Jews were killed between 27 and August 30, 1941. The largest massacre was at a ravine called Babi Yar outside Kiev, where 33,771 Jews were killed on 29–30 September 1941. The Germans used the ravine for mass killings throughout the war, up to 100,000 may have been killed there. Toward the Holocaust. At first the Einsatzgruppen targeted the male Jewish intelligentsia, defined as male Jews aged 15–60 who had worked for the state and in certain professions. The commandos described them as Bolshevist functionaries and similar. From August 1941 they began to murder women and children too. Christopher Browning reports that on August 1, 1941, the SS Cavalry Brigade passed an order to its units, explicit order by RFSS. All Jews must be shot. Drive the female Jews into the swamps. 2 years later, in a speech on October 6, 1943 to party leaders, Heinrich Himmler said he had ordered that women and children be shot, but according to Peter Long-Erich and Christian Gerlach, the murder of women and children began at different times in different areas, suggesting local influence. Historians agree that there was a gradual radicalization between the spring and autumn of 1941 of what Long-Erich calls Germany's Judenpolitik, but they disagree about whether a decision Vorentscheidung to murder the European Jews had been made at this point. According to Browning, writing in 2004, most historians say there was no order, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, to kill all the Soviet Jews. Long-Eric wrote in 2010 that the gradual increase in brutality and numbers killed between July and September 1941 suggests there was no particular order. Instead, it was a question of a process of increasingly radical interpretations of orders. Concentration and labor camps. Germany first used concentration camps as places of terror and unlawful incarceration of political opponents. Large numbers of Jews were not sent there until after Kristallnacht in November 1938. After war broke out in 1939, new camps were established, many outside Germany in occupied Europe. Most wartime prisoners of the camps were not Germans but belonged to countries under German occupation. After 1942, the economic function of the camps, previously secondary to their penal and terror functions, came to the fore. Forced labor of camp prisoners became commonplace. The guards became much more brutal, and the death rate increased as the guards not only beat and starved prisoners but killed them more frequently. Vernichtung durch Arbeit was a policy. Camp inmates would literally be worked to death, or to physical exhaustion, at which point they would be gassed or shot. The Germans estimated the average prisoner's lifespan in a concentration camp at 3 months, as a result of lack of food and clothing, constant epidemics, and frequent punishments for the most minor transgressions. The shifts were long and often involved exposure to dangerous materials. Transportation to and between camps was often carried out in closed freight cars with little air or water, long delays and prisoners packed tightly. In mid-1942 work camps began requiring newly arrived prisoners to be placed in quarantine for 4 weeks. Prisoners wore colored triangles on their uniforms, the color denoting the reason for their incarceration. Red signified a political prisoner, Jehovah's Witnesses had purple triangles, asocials and criminals wore black and green, and gay men wore pink. Jews wore 2 yellow triangles, one over another to form a 6-pointed star. Prisoners in Auschwitz were tattooed on arrival with an identification number. Germany's allies. Romania. Romania ranks first among Holocaust perpetrator countries other than Germany. Romanian antisemitic legislation was not an attempt to placate the Germans, but rather entirely homegrown, preceding German hegemony and Nazi Germany itself. The ascendance of Germany enabled Romania to disregard the minorities' treaties that were imposed upon the country after the First World War. Antisemitic legislation in Romania was usually aimed at exploiting Jews rather than humiliating them as in Germany. At the end of 1937, the government of Octavian Goga came to power, Romania thus becoming the second overtly antisemitic state in Europe. Romania was the second country in Europe after Germany to enact antisemitic legislation, and the only one besides Germany to do so before the 1938 Anschluss. Romania was the only country other than Germany itself that implemented all the steps of the destruction process, from definitions to killings. According to Dan Stone, the murder of Jews in Romania was essentially an independent undertaking. Although Jewish persecution was unsystematic within the pre-war borders of Romania, it was systematic in the Romanian-occupied territories of the Soviet Union. Romania implemented anti-Jewish measures in May and June 1940 as part of its efforts towards an alliance with Germany. By March 1941 all Jews had lost their jobs and had their property confiscated. In June 1941 Romania joined Germany in its invasion of the Soviet Union, and within the first few weeks of the invasion, almost the entire rural Jewish population of Bessarabia and Bukovina were decimated. Thousands of Jews were murdered in January and June 1941 in the Bucharest pogrom and Iai pogrom. According to a 2004 report by Tovia Frilling and others, up to 14,850 Jews were murdered during the Iai pogrom. The Romanian military murdered up to 25,000 Jews during the Odessa massacre between October 18, 1941 and March 1942, assisted by gendarmes and the police. Within the city of Odessa, Jews were segregated to ghettos where they were later deported en masse, with the majority dying from disease, hunger, and murder. In July 1941, Mihai Antonescu, Romania's deputy prime minister, said it was time for total ethnic purification, for a revision of national life, and for purging our race of all those elements which are foreign to its soul, which have grown like mistletoes and darken our future. Romania set up concentration camps in Transnistria, reportedly extremely brutal, where 154,000,170,000 Jews were deported from 1941 to 1943. In the Odessa and Pervomisk regions alone, Romanian authorities were responsible for the death of over 150,000 Jews. Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Hungary. Bulgaria introduced anti-Jewish measures between 1940 and 1943. It annexed Thrace and Macedonia, and in February 1943 agreed to a demand from Germany that it deport 20,000 Jews to the Treblinka extermination camp. All 11,000 Jews from the annexed territories were sent to be murdered, and plans were made to deport 6,0008,000 Bulgarian Jews from Sofia to meet the quota. When this became public, the Orthodox Church and many Bulgarians protested, and King Boris III cancelled the plans. Instead, Jews native to Bulgaria were sent to the provinces. Stone writes that Slovakia, led by Roman Catholic priest Joseph Tiso, was one of the most loyal of the collaborationist regimes. It deported 7,500 Jews in 1938 on its own initiative, introduced anti-Jewish measures in 1940, and by the autumn of 1942 had deported around 60,000 Jews to Poland. Another 2,396 were deported and 2,257 killed that autumn during an uprising, and 13,500 were deported between October 1944 and March 1945. According to Stone, the Holocaust in Slovakia was far more than a German project, even if it was carried out in the context of a puppet state. Although Hungary expelled Jews who were not citizens from its newly annexed lands in 1941, it did not deport most of its Jews until the German invasion of Hungary in March 1944. Between May 15 and early July 1944, 437,000 Jews were deported, mostly to Auschwitz, where most of them were murdered by gas. There were 4 transports a day, each carrying 3,000 people. In Budapest in October and November 1944, the Hungarian Arrow Cross forced 50,000 Jews to march to the Austrian border as part of a deal with Germany to supply forced labor. So many died that the marches were stopped. Italy, Finland, and Japan. Italy introduced antisemitic measures, but there was less anti-Semitism there than in Germany, and Italian-occupied countries were generally safer for Jews than those occupied by Germany. Most Italian Jews, over 40,000, survived the Holocaust. In September 1943, Germany occupied the northern and central areas of Italy and established a fascist puppet state, the Italian Social Republic or Salo Republic. Officers from RSHA 4B4, a Gestapo unit, began deporting Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The first group of 1,034 Jews arrived from Rome on October 23, 1943, 839 were murdered by gas. Around 8,500 Jews were deported in all. Several forced labor camps for Jews were established in Italian-controlled Libya. Almost 2,600 Libyan Jews were sent to camps, where 562 were murdered. In Finland, the government was pressured in 1942 to hand over its 1,200 non-Finnish Jews to Germany. After opposition from both the government and public, 8 non-Finnish Jews were deported in late 1942, only one survived the war. Japan had little anti-Semitism in its society and did not persecute Jews in most of the territories it controlled. Jews in Shanghai were confined, but despite German pressure they were not killed. Final solution. Pearl Harbor, Germany declares war on the United States. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, an American naval base in Honolulu, Hawaii, killing 2,403 Americans. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan, and on December 11, Germany declared war on the United States. According to Deborah Dwork and Robert Jan van Pelt, Hitler had trusted American Jews, whom he assumed were all-powerful, to keep the United States out of the war in the interests of German Jews. When America declared war, he blamed the Jews. Nearly 3 years earlier, on January 30, 1939, Hitler had told the Reichstag, if the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will be not the Bolshevizing of the earth, and thus a victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. In the view of Christian Gerlach, Hitler announced his decision in principle to annihilate the Jews on or around December 12, 1941, one day after his declaration of war. On that day, Hitler gave a speech in his apartment at the Reich Chancellery to senior Nazi party leaders, the Reichsleiter and the Gauleiter. The following day, Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, noted in his diary, regarding the Jewish question, the Führer is determined to clear the table. He warned the Jews that if they were to cause another world war, it would lead to their destruction. Those were not empty words. Now the world war has come. The destruction of the Jews must be its necessary consequence. We cannot be sentimental about it. Christopher Browning argues that Hitler gave no order during the Reich Chancellery meeting but made clear that he had intended his 1939 warning to the Jews to be taken literally, and he signaled to party leaders that they could give appropriate orders to others. According to Gerlach, an unidentified former German Sicherheitsdienst officer wrote in a report in 1944, after defecting to Switzerland, after America entered the war, the annihilation of all European Jews was initiated on the Führer's order. 4 days after Hitler's meeting with party leaders, Hans Frank, Governor-General of the General Government Area of Occupied Poland, who was at the meeting, spoke to district governors, "We must put an end to the Jews. I will in principle proceed only on the assumption that they will disappear. They must go." On December 18, 1941, Hitler and Himmler held a meeting to which Himmler referred in his appointment book as Judenfrage als Partisanen Ausuraten. Browning interprets this as a meeting to discuss how to justify and speak about the killing. Wannsee Conference. SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Head Office, convened what became known as the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942 at M. Grossen Wannsee 5658, a villa in Berlin's Wannsee suburb. The meeting had been scheduled for December 9, 1941, and invitations had been sent between November 29 and December 1, but on December 8 it had been postponed indefinitely, probably because of Pearl Harbor. On January 8, Heydrich sent out notes again, this time suggesting 20 January. The 15 men present at Wannsee included Heydrich, SS Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann, head of Reich Security Head Office Referat 4B4, SS Major General Heinrich Müller, head of RSHA Department 4, and other SS and party leaders. According to Browning, 8 of the 15 had doctorates, thus it was not a dim-witted crowd unable to grasp what was going to be said to them. 30 copies of the minutes, the Wannsee Protocol, were made. Copy number 16 was found by American prosecutors in March 1947 in a German Foreign Office folder. Written by Eichmann and stamped top secret, the minutes were written in euphemistic language on Heydrich's instructions, according to Eichmann's later testimony. Discussing plans for a final solution to the Jewish question, and a final solution to the Jewish question in Europe, the conference was held to coordinate efforts and policies, and to ensure that authority rested with Heydrich. There was discussion about whether to include the German Mischling. Heydrich told the meeting, "Another possible solution of the problem has now taken the place of emigration, i.e. the evacuation of the Jews to the east, provided that the Führer gives the appropriate approval in advance." He continued, "Under proper guidance, in the course of the final solution, the Jews are to be allocated for appropriate labor in the east. Able-bodied Jews, separated according to sex, will be taken in large work columns to these areas for work on roads, in the course of which action doubtless a large portion will be eliminated by natural causes. The possible final remnant will, since it will undoubtedly consist of the most resistant portion, have to be treated accordingly because it is the product of natural selection and would, if released, act as the seed of a new Jewish revival. In the course of the practical execution of the final solution, Europe will be combed through from west to east. Germany proper, including the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, will have to be handled first due to the housing problem and additional social and political necessities. The evacuated Jews will first be sent, group by group, to so-called transit ghettos, from which they will be transported to the east. The evacuations were regarded as provisional. The final solution would encompass the 11 million Jews living in territories controlled by Germany and elsewhere in Europe, including Britain, Ireland, Switzerland, Turkey, Sweden, Portugal, Spain, and Hungary, dependent on military developments. According to Long-Erich, the Jews were to be annihilated by a combination of forced labor and mass murder. Extermination camps. At the end of 1941 in occupied Poland, the Germans began building additional camps or expanding existing ones. Auschwitz, for example, was expanded in October 1941 by building Auschwitz II-Birkenau a few kilometers away. By the spring or summer of 1942, gas chambers had been installed in these new facilities, except for Chelmno, which used gas vans. Other camps sometimes described as extermination camps include Malý Trostinec near Minsk in the occupied Soviet Union, where 65,000 are thought to have been murdered, mostly by shooting but also in gas vans, Mauthausen in Austria, Stutthof near Gdansk, Poland, and Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück in Germany. Gas vans. Gas chambers. Collaboration. Although the Holocaust was planned and directed by Germans, the Nazi regime found willing collaborators in other countries, or forced others into participation. This included individual collaboration as well as state collaboration. According to Dan Stone, the Holocaust was a pan-European phenomenon, a series of holocausts impossible to conduct without local collaborators and Germany's allies. Stone writes that many European states, under the extreme circumstances of World War II, took upon themselves the task of solving the Jewish question in their own way. Resistance. Jewish resistance. There was almost no resistance in the ghettos in Poland until the end of 1942. Raoul Hilberg accounted for this by evoking the history of Jewish persecution. Compliance might avoid inflaming the situation until the onslaught abated. Timothy Snyder noted that it was only during the 3 months after the deportations of July-September 1942 that agreement on the need for armed resistance was reached. Several resistance groups were formed, such as the Jewish Combat Organization and Jewish Military Union in the Warsaw Ghetto and the United Partisan Organization in Vilna. Over 100 revolts and uprisings occurred in at least 19 ghettos and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. The best known is the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April 1943, when the Germans arrived to send the remaining inhabitants to extermination camps. Forced to retreat on April 19 from the ZOB and ZZW fighters, they returned later that day under the command of SS General Jürgen Stroop. Around 1,000 poorly armed fighters held the SS at bay for 4 weeks. Polish and Jewish accounts stated that hundreds or thousands of Germans had been killed, while the Germans reported 16 dead. The Germans said that 14,000 Jews had been killed, 7,000 during the fighting and 7,000 sent to Treblinka, and between 53,000 and 56,000 deported. According to Gwardia Ludowa, a Polish resistance newspaper, in May 1943. From behind the screen of smoke and fire, in which the ranks of fighting Jewish partisans are dying, the legend of the exceptional fighting qualities of the Germans is being undermined. The fighting Jews have won for us what is most important, the truth about the weakness of the Germans. During a revolt in Treblinka on August 2, 1943, inmates killed 5 or 6 guards and set fire to camp buildings. Several managed to escape. In the Białystok ghetto on August 16, Jewish insurgents fought for 5 days when the Germans announced mass deportations. On October 14, Jewish prisoners in Sobibor attempted an escape, killing 11 SS officers, as well as 2 or 3 Ukrainian and Volksdeutsche guards. According to Yitzhak Arad, this was the highest number of SS officers killed in a single revolt. Around 300 inmates escaped, but 100 were recaptured and shot. On October 7, 1944, 300 Jewish members, mostly Greek or Hungarian, of the Sonderkommando at Auschwitz learned they were about to be killed, and staged an uprising, blowing up crematorium 4. 3 SS officers were killed. The Sonderkommando at crematorium 2 threw their Oberkapo into an oven when they heard the commotion, believing that a camp uprising had begun. By the time the SS had regained control, 451 members of the Sonderkommando were dead, 212 survived. Estimates of Jewish participation in partisan units throughout Europe range from 20,000 to 100,000. In the occupied Polish and Soviet territories, thousands of Jews fled into the swamps or forests and joined the partisans, although the partisan movements did not always welcome them. An estimated 20,000 to 30,000 joined the Soviet partisan movement. One of the famous Jewish groups was the Bielski partisans in Belarus, led by the Bielski brothers. Jews also joined Polish forces, including the Home Army. According to Timothy Snyder, more Jews fought in the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 than in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943. Polish resistance and flow of information. The Polish government in exile in London received information about the extermination camp at Auschwitz from the Polish leadership in Warsaw from 1940 onwards, and by August 1942 there was a continual flow of information to and from Poland, according to Michael Fleming. This was in large measure thanks to Captain Witold Pilecki of the Polish Home Army, who was sent to the camp in September 1940 after allowing himself to be arrested in Warsaw. An inmate until he escaped in April 1943, his mission was to set up a resistance movement, prepare to take over the camp, and smuggle out information. On January 6, 1942, the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, sent out diplomatic notes about German atrocities, based on reports about mass graves and bodies surfacing in areas the Red Army had liberated, as well as witness reports from German-occupied areas. According to Fleming, in May and June 1942, London was told about the extermination camps at Chelmno, Sobibor, and Besk. Zlama Berwiner escaped from Chelmno in February and passed information to the Oneg Shabbat group in the Warsaw Ghetto. His report was known by his pseudonym as the Grohanowski Report. Also in 1942, Jan Karski sent information to the Allies after being smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto twice. By July 1942, Polish leaders in Warsaw had learned about the mass killing of Jews in Auschwitz. The Polish Interior Ministry prepared a report, Sprawozdanie 642, which said at the end, "There are different methods of execution. People are shot by firing squads, killed by an air hammer/Hammerluft/, and poisoned by gas in special gas chambers. Prisoners condemned to death by the Gestapo are murdered by the first two methods. The third method, the gas chamber, is employed for those who are ill or incapable of work and those who have been brought in transports especially for the purpose/Soviet prisoners of war, and, recently Jews/. Sprahousden E642 had reached London by November 12, 1942, where it was translated into English to become part of a 108-page report on conditions in Poland, on which the date November 27, 1942 was handwritten. This report was sent to the Polish embassy in Washington, D.C. On December 10, 1942, the Polish Foreign Affairs Minister, Edward Raczynski, addressed the fledgling United Nations on the killings. The address was distributed with the title "The Mass Extermination of Jews in German-Occupied Poland." He told them about the use of poison gas, about Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, that the Polish underground had referred to them as extermination camps, and that tens of thousands of Jews had been killed in Belzec in March and April 1942. 1 in 3 Jews in Poland were already dead, he estimated, from a population of 3,130,000. Raczynski's address was covered by the New York Times and the Times of London. Winston Churchill received it, and Anthony Eden presented it to the British cabinet. On December 17, 1942, 11 allies issued the joint declaration by members of the United Nations condemning the bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination. The British and American governments were reluctant to publicize the intelligence they had received. A BBC Hungarian service memo, written by Carlyle Macartney, said in 1942, "We shouldn't mention the Jews at all." The British government's view was that the Hungarian people's anti-Semitism would make them distrust the Allies if Allied broadcasts focused on the Jews. In the United States, where anti-Semitism and isolationism were common, the government similarly feared turning the war into one about the Jews. Although governments and the German public appear to have understood what was happening to the Jews, it seems the Jews themselves did not. According to Saul Friedlander, testimonies left by Jews from all over occupied Europe indicate that, in contradistinction to vast segments of surrounding society, the victims did not understand what was ultimately in store for them. In Western Europe, he writes, Jewish communities failed to piece the information together, while in Eastern Europe they could not accept that the stories they had heard from elsewhere would end up applying to them too. End of the war. The Holocaust in Hungary. By 1943 it was evident to the leadership of the armed forces that Germany was losing the war. Rail shipments of Jews were still arriving regularly from Western and Southern Europe at the extermination camps. Shipments of Jews had priority on the German railways over anything but the army's needs, and continued even in the face of the increasingly dire military situation at the end of 1942. Army leaders and economic managers complained about this diversion of resources and the killing of skilled Jewish workers, but Nazi leaders rated ideological imperatives above economic considerations. The mass murder reached a frenetic pace in 1944 when Auschwitz gassed nearly 500,000 people. On March 19, 1944, Hitler ordered the military occupation of Hungary and dispatched Adolf Eichmann to supervise the deportation of its Jews. Between May 15 and July 9, 440,000 Jews were deported from Hungary to Auschwitz to Birkenau, almost all sent directly to the gas chambers. A month before the deportations began, Eichmann offered through an intermediary, Joel Brand, to exchange 1 million Jews for 10,000 trucks from the Allies, which the Germans would agree not to use on the Western Front. The British thwarted the proposal by leaking it. The Times called it a new level of fantasy and self-deception. Publication of the Verbewetzler report halted Hungarian government cooperation with Jewish deportations for several months and sparked international interventions that saved tens of thousands of lives. Death marches. As the Soviet armed forces advanced, the SS closed down the camps in eastern Poland and tried to conceal what had happened. The gas chambers were dismantled, the crematoria dynamited, and the mass graves dug up and corpses cremated. From January to April 1945, the SS sent inmates westward on death marches to camps in Germany and Austria. In January 1945, the Germans held records of 714,000 inmates in concentration camps. By May, 250,000 had died during these marches. Already sick after exposure to violence and starvation, they were marched to train stations and transported for days without food or shelter in open freight cars, then forced to march again at the other end to the new camp. Some went by truck or wagons, others were marched the entire distance. Those who lagged behind or fell were shot. Liberation. The first major camp encountered by Allied troops, Majdanek, was discovered by the advancing Soviets, along with its gas chambers, on July 25, 1944. Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were never liberated, but were destroyed by the Germans in 1943. On January 17, 1945, 58,000 Auschwitz inmates were sent on a death march westwards. When the camp was liberated by the Soviets on January 27, they found just 7,000 inmates in the three main camps and 500 in sub-camps. Buchenwald was liberated by the Americans on April 11, Bergen-Belsen by the British on April 15, Dachau by the Americans on April 29, Ravensbrück by the Soviets on April 30, and Mauthausen by the Americans on May 5. The Red Cross took control of Theresienstadt on May 3, days before the Soviets arrived. The British 11th Armoured Division found around 60,000 prisoners when they liberated Bergen-Belsen, as well as 13,000 unburied corpses. Another 10,000 people died from typhus or malnutrition over the following weeks. Death toll. The Jews killed represented around one-third of world Jewry and about two-thirds of European Jewry, based on a pre-war figure of 9.7 million Jews in Europe. Most heavily concentrated in the East, the pre-war Jewish population in Europe was 3.5 million in Poland, 3 million in the Soviet Union, nearly 800,000 in Romania, and 700,000 in Hungary. Germany had over 500,000. The death camps in occupied Poland accounted for half the Jews murdered. At Auschwitz, the number of Jewish victims was 960,000. Treblinka 870,000, Belzec 600,000, Chelmno 320,000, Sobibor 250,000, and Majdanek 79,000. The most commonly cited death toll is the 6 million given by Adolf Eichmann to SS member Wilhelm Hodel, who signed an affidavit mentioning this figure in 1945. Historians' estimates range from 4,204,000 to 7 million. According to Yad Vashem, LL, the serious research confirms that between 5 and 6 million Jews were murdered. Death rates were heavily dependent on the survival of European states willing to protect their Jewish citizens. In countries allied to Germany, the state's control over its citizens, including the Jews, was seen as a matter of sovereignty. The continuous presence of state institutions thereby prevented the Jewish community's complete destruction. In occupied countries, the survival of the state was likewise correlated with lower Jewish death rates. 75% of Jews survived in France and 99% in Denmark, but 75% died in the Netherlands, as did 99% of Jews who were in Estonia when the Germans arrived. The Nazis declared Estonia Judenfrei in January 1942 at the Wannsee Conference. The survival of Jews in countries where states were not destroyed demonstrates the crucial influence of non-Germans, according to Christian Gerlach. Jews who lived where pre-war statehood was destroyed or displaced were at the mercy of sometimes hostile local populations, in addition to the Germans. Almost all Jews in German-occupied Poland, the Baltic states and the USSR were murdered, with a 5% chance of survival on average. Of Poland's 3.3 million Jews, about 90% were murdered. Other victims of Nazi persecution: Soviet civilians and POWs. The Nazis regarded the Slavs as untermenschen. German troops destroyed villages throughout the Soviet Union, rounded up civilians for forced labor in Germany, and caused famine by taking foodstuffs. In Belarus, Germany imposed a regime that deported 380,000 people for slave labor, murdered 1.6 million, and destroyed at least 5,295 settlements. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates that 3.3 million of 5.7 million Soviet POWs died in German custody. The death rates decreased when the POWs were needed to help the German war effort. By 1943, 500,000 had been deployed as slave labor. A 1995 paper published by M.V. Filimoshin, an associate of the Russian Defense Ministry, put the civilian death toll in the regions occupied by Germany at 13.7 million. Filimoshin cited sources from the Soviet era to support his figures and used the terms genocide and premeditated extermination when referring to deaths of 7.4 million civilians caused by direct, intentional violence. Civilians killed in reprisals during the Soviet partisan war account for a major portion. Filimoshin estimated that civilian forced laborer deaths in Germany totaled 2.1 million. Germany had a policy of forced confiscation of food that resulted in famine deaths of an estimated 6% of the population, or 4.1 million. Russian government sources currently cite these civilian casualty figures in their official statements. Ethnic Poles. From the start of the war against Poland, Germany intended to realize Adolf Hitler's plan, set out in his book Mein Kampf, to acquire living space in the East for massive settlement of German colonists. Hitler's plan combined classic imperialism with Nazi racial ideology. While the long-term goal of Nazi Germany was removal of Jews from occupied Poland, in the initial months of occupation the SS predominantly directed physical violence towards ethnic Poles, arresting and executing educated elites in an attempt to prevent the development of organized resistance. On September 7, 1939, Reinhard Heydrich stated that all Polish nobles, clergy, and Jews were to be murdered. On September 12, Wilhelm Keitel added Poland's intelligentsia to the list. On March 15, 1940, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler stated, "All Polish specialists will be exploited in our military-industrial complex. Later, all Poles will disappear from this world. It is imperative that the great German nation consider the elimination of all Polish people as its chief task." At the end of 1940, Hitler confirmed the plan to liquidate all leading elements in Poland. After Germany lost the war, the International Military Tribunal at the Nuremberg trials and Poland's Supreme National Tribunal concluded that the aim of German policies in Poland, the extermination of Poles and Jews, was a genocide in biological terms. An estimated 1.8–1.9 million non-Jewish Polish citizens were killed by Germans during the war. At least 200,000 died in concentration camps, around 146,000 in Auschwitz. Others died in massacres or in revolts such as the Warsaw Uprising, where 150,000–200,000 were killed. Roma. Historians estimate that Germany and its allies killed between 250,000 and 500,000 Roma, around 25–50% of the community in Europe. Research cited by Ian Hancock suggests the pre-war Romani population of Europe may have been much higher, resulting in estimates of up to 1.5 million Roma deaths. Unlike Jews, who were predominantly transported to and murdered in mass extermination camps, Romanies outside the Reich were mostly massacred in smaller groups of several hundred or less, in many different places, together with the exclusion of Romanies from most contemporary European censuses. This makes it impossible for historians to determine the precise number of Romani victims in Poland, Yugoslavia, White Ruthenia, and Ukraine, the regions in which most are thought to have been killed. Robert Ritter, head of Germany's Racial Hygiene and Demographic Biology Research Unit, called Roma a peculiar form of the human species who are incapable of development and came about by mutation. In May 1942, they were placed under similar laws to the Jews, and in December Himmler ordered that they be sent to Auschwitz, unless they had served in the Wehrmacht. He adjusted the order on November 15, 1943 to allow sedentary gypsies and part gypsies in the occupied Soviet areas to be viewed as citizens. In Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, the Roma were subject to restrictions on movement and confinement to collection camps, while in Eastern Europe they were sent to concentration camps, where large numbers were murdered. Political and religious opponents. German communists, socialists, and trade unionists were among the first to be sent to concentration camps. Nacht und Nebel, a directive issued by Hitler on December 7, 1941, resulted in the disappearance, torture and death of political activists throughout German-occupied Europe. The courts had sentenced 1,793 people to death by April 1944, according to Jack Fischel. Because they refused to pledge allegiance to the Nazi Party or serve in the military, Jehovah's Witnesses were sent to concentration camps, where they were given the option of renouncing their faith and submitting to the state's authority. Between 2,700 and 3,300 were sent to the camps, where 1,400 died. According to German historian Detlef Garb, no other religious movement resisted the pressure to conform to National Socialism with comparable unanimity and steadfastness. Homosexuals. Around 100,000 gay men were arrested in Germany and 50,000 jailed between 1933 and 1945. 5,000–15,000 are thought to have been sent to concentration camps. Hundreds were castrated, sometimes voluntarily to avoid criminal sentences. In 1936, Himmler created the Reich Central Office for the Combating of Homosexuality and Abortion. The police closed gay bars and shut down gay publications. Lesbians were left relatively unaffected. The Nazis saw them as asocials, rather than sexual deviants. However, where sexuality intersected with other identities, lesbianism could be used as an additional reason for persecution. In some concentration camps, brothels were established to punish lesbian women by raping them. Sex with Jewish women was forbidden on grounds of racial disgrace by the Nazis, but rape was not considered a racial disgrace in concentration camps. Afro-Germans. There were 5,000–25,000 Afro-Germans in Germany when the Nazis came to power. Although blacks in Germany and German-occupied Europe were subjected to incarceration, sterilization, and murder, there was no program to kill them as a group. Aftermath and legacy. Trials. During the International Military Tribunal, 21 Nazi leaders were tried, primarily for waging wars of aggression, but the trial also exposed the systematic murder of European Jews. 12 additional trials before American courts from 1946 to 1949 tried another 177 defendants. In these trials, the Holocaust took center stage. These trials were ineffective in their goal of re-educating Germans. By 1948, only 30% of Germans believed Nazism was a bad idea. A consensus in West German society demanded amnesty and release of the convicted prisoners. West Germany initially tried few ex-Nazis, but after the 1958 Ulm-Einsatzkommando trial, the government set up a dedicated agency. Other trials of Nazis and collaborators took place in Western and Eastern Europe. In 1960, Mossad agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina and brought him to Israel to stand trial on 15 charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against the Jewish people. He was convicted in December 1961 and executed in June 1962. Eichmann's trial revived interest in war criminals and the Holocaust in general. Reparations. The government of Israel requested $1.5 billion from the Federal Republic of Germany in March 1951 to finance the rehabilitation of 500,000 Jewish survivors, arguing that Germany had stolen $6 billion from the European Jews. Israelis were divided about the idea of taking money from Germany. The Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany was opened in New York, and after negotiations the claim was reduced to $845 million. West Germany allocated another $125 million for reparations in 1988. Companies such as BMW, Deutsche Bank, Ford, Opel, Siemens, and Volkswagen faced lawsuits for their use of forced labor during the war. In response, Germany set up the Remembrance, Responsibility, and Future Foundation in 2000, which paid €4.45 billion to former slave laborers. In 2013, Germany agreed to provide €772 million to fund nursing care, social services, and medication for 56,000 Holocaust survivors around the world. The French state-owned railway company, the SNCF, agreed in 2014 to pay $60 million to Jewish American survivors, around $100,000 each, for its role in the transport of 76,000 Jews from France to extermination camps between 1942 and 1944. Remembrance and historiography. The tendency to see the Holocaust as a unique event was influential in early Holocaust scholarship, but came under contestation, and eventually mainstream Holocaust scholarship came to reject explicit claims of uniqueness, while recognizing differences between the Holocaust and other genocides. In popular culture, Hitler is a hegemonic historical analogy for evil, and Nazi comparisons are common. Yom HaShoah became Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day in 1951. At least 37 countries and the United Nations have similar observances. Explanatory notes.